Wow, I think we're actually, not only are we live, but I guess today I learned that PeerTube supports automatically flipping the stream from the waiting page to the live page when the stream starts. I didn't know it did that. Welcome back to the stream. We're going live on the usual spots. We're on Twitch, we're on YouTube, and we're on Diode Zone. This is the continuation of a software project that has been trying to make a weird granular synthesizer plugin. Oh, and Tuco just came back. Tuco, where do you want to be? Not on top of the keyboard again, maybe? Oh, Tuco. Where do you want to be, honey? Not chewing those, right? Gosh. No. Why do you want these? Hey. Well, welcome back to the stream, folks. We've got a nice purring cat here. I guess we ended last stream with Tuco also. He was camped out on my keyboard, kind of forcing me to, oh, are you going to do the same thing? Please don't. I know it's comfy, but I need to type. Oh. Are you jumping or sitting? Oh, sitting on the warm thing. Tuco, is that better? So I was saying, as the last stream, we had something that was just about ready for a synthesizer. We were starting to put together some of the data structures that we would need. So this is an audio plugin built using Juice, which is a C++ framework. And it provides a bunch of the infrastructure for doing various kinds of audio plugins. It does have a base class that's intended to handle a lot of what's necessary in implementing a polyphonic synthesizer. So it has classes that you can subclass to have per voice stuff, and it has something which it calls a sound, which I think you could map to different things. Like, it seems pretty designed to map to something like a single sample in a sample synthesizer. In this setup, I have a sound representing a bundle of parameters that all affect different parts of the synthesizer, and then those parameters end up getting kind of shuttled off to those different subsystems. Some of the parameters affect the window function. Some of the parameters affect the choice of grains over time. Some of the parameters affect the timing of how the grains are combined. I might just kind of shut up and play with this for a minute, because that's probably a better way to convey a sense of what this is doing. And then maybe we'll talk about the code. I think the next thing I want to dive into code-wise is probably actually going to be in the GUI. I did most of the audio processing for this kind of off-stream, like over the weekend, and we can certainly talk about that, but it was... I don't know, I wasn't confident that it was the sort of thing I could figure out how to do, like, while I was also trying to be live. But it's basically what I was talking about, you know, what I alluded to before, where we had some processing that occurs per synthesizer voice that queues up grain waveforms that it might be processing in an overlapping way. So the idea is that each voice in the synthesizer is like one deterministic train of grains that all have the same parameters. And there's a couple of exceptions to that. I did end up having to add this feature where whenever possible, it'll substitute a grain for a different one that was used on that same voice recently if it needs a grain that is not loaded yet, which was necessary for some parameter choices. That's part of what I want to get into with the UI, though. This is already getting into a state where there are enough knobs to tune and enough weird things that you can do with it that it would benefit from a visualization of what it's doing, so that you can actually get a better sense of like where you're at in its current parameter space. We have individual grains. There's a question about the data set. This is just a smallish single voice TikTok data set right now, but I have a bunch of data sets I'll be flipping through. They're basically labeled, the ones starting with TT voice or just TikTok voice. And most of these, I think all of the ones that I have currently exclude the kind of novelty TikTok voices, so these are just the regular language voices. And then they're labeled by language. This number that's like 10K or 1K is the number of input files that I used. So the ones that are not labeled with that are using all the input files I had. So they're a lot bigger. And there aren't as many of them because they take a while to generate. These W tags are the width of the grains in seconds. So W10 is actually super wide, and it's actually kind of annoyingly long. Like, I don't know why you would actually want that much relatively irrelevant audio. But I thought it was worth experimenting with. The default, if it's not listed, is 3 seconds. So most of them have a width of 3 seconds away from the center of the grain, which seems like plenty. There's some of these that are W1, which are just a little shorter. That's currently kind of important for the UI, or like for the user to know, I guess, because the widths that you specify with these parameters are relative to the maximum allowed. So if the width is turned up to 1, that's the maximum, but the actual width of that in seconds at the current with the current settings would depend on the maximum width in the file and also the speed warp setting, which I guess we'll get to. I haven't even touched speed warp yet. Let's try one that has multiple TikTok voices, but not window 10. So here's a big one that has 10,000 files, German, English, Japanese, TikTok voices, with 10,024 samples per bin.
Available. Waters. Bankrupt. Rent. Non-com. Rent. Allies. Searching. Sting for. Sting with. Haynes.
In eine Branche überlegt. Verlassen.
Woanders bilden ja irgendwo Komet, gemord, Shinbit, Sing, Shins, wenn wegen sie, nunmehr
Firmen, wo die Alben 3 sitzt, häufig.
Lings. Ildes. Ogi. Even. Servancy. Slade. Non-com.
I don't know how much explaining we want to do in this stream, but there are a couple of questions. Somebody's asking if all the samples are mono. Yeah, the ones I've been experimenting with so far are mono, and the analysis step I have right now is currently mixing down to mono if there were any stereo inputs. But I've been trying to make the player pretty much support any number of channels, so it'll currently just happily process a stereo file. I haven't really tried that, but I've been trying to write the code that way. I don't know how useful that is. I guess it would depend on, like, a lot of this in practice seems to be limited by the audio quality of the source data that you have. So I will get into that a little bit, but like these TikTok samples are very regular. You know, they all have very consistent loudness and like audio recording quality and everything, whereas some of the sources not so much. I was experimenting with audio samples from Bob Ross episodes, and those were actually really interesting, but I was having some problems with the audio source quality because some of them had some distortion, and so I would want to work on my pre-processing tools to get those to throw out audio that has quality problems. And then someone's wondering what the grains are, and yeah, basically I'm using it in the way that a granular synthesizer would use it, where I just mean it's a short piece of audio that I'm using pretty much in its entirety. So whereas some synthesizers would be constructing audio from individual like sine waves or individual like kinds of feedback elements or individual simulations, or they would be doing subtractive synthesis where you have a bunch of filters that are shaping some noise or some other signal. granular synthesis is like kind of just copying and pasting little bits of audio. So people use the name to refer to a bunch of different things, but you'll see granular synthesis plugins in audio software a lot of the time that will just have like a buffer of samples in memory, and will let you like grab little bits of audio from that buffer in different ways. So they might have a way to just like scrub through the sample using a position selector or something. I wanted to experiment with using really big data sets and pre-processing them so that I could select them by pitch and maybe by other things. But right now it's mostly pitch plus a kind of arbitrary other axis, which right now just maps to like which input file it is. So for the TikTok dataset, that arbitrary other axis is like which voice it is. Someone's also wondering about sample rate. Again, my tool is pretty flexible, but the data set that I've got is mostly 24 kilohertz, just because that's what the text-to-speech engine produces, since it doesn't really need like high frequency components for the most part. But yeah, I mean, if I can find some higher quality recordings, like I think the next thing I want to try to do is make my tool reprocess stuff like TV episodes a little bit better, because right now it's very bad at dealing with long input files. That's been more of a issue than some of the other things.
Fervency, non-part, non-com, 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 darn, phonetically using technical disponents. Non-text, non-text, waters, booster, angel, linear, done that. Line, tanker, done that. Non-com, Universe, plain, needy, cheap. Or does it accommodated? Damien, warnings. Seemlier, flawless. Innings towards around. Thunderclaps prod. Ameliorates fetus. Ring stimulation during fetus. Smoother. Keto electronic treated bracelet as a sphere airman. Underwear.
Chlorinating Z, varnishing erratic, tologist fitting.
Mouthwashes.
Gegen zu 90,
Ungern
90 gegen zu
Chlorinating Z,
Flung, wohin, Flung,
tologist fitting.
Flung,
science and sinfulness.
I'm starting way out here outside the area. I'm starting way out here outside the area. Still a little bit heavy where they look
and you
like
don't even know, and it all of a sudden when it's all...
Where do you put lambs? Where do you put lambs?
See, and you don't even know, and it all of a sudden...
You need to use
water go in there, and that'll do some little, and that'll some water in. Let a little bit of water go in there, and that'll do some little drizzles. And that'll do some little, go in there, and that'll do some little.
You need to use a spray.
And you don't even know, and it all of a sudden when...
Where do you put lambs? A little bit heavy where they look like it.
This is one of those things that you... Now we're going to repeat this stroke.
Starting way out here outside. Starting way out here outside.
And Prussian blue. And Prussian blue. And Prussian blue. So, that are going on where you want your mountain to live. Where you want your mountain to live. I'm going to just start. I'm going to just start your mountain to live. Where you start. There's all some there's maybe just where you want your mountain to live.
From the back here in the distance, there's a little.
Not too often.
And you know the
using all these and Prussian blue. And Prussian blue. Prussian blue. So, on this tape, we will paint. On this tape, we will paint Prussian blue. So, and Prussian blue.
Pretty sure I crashed it. Gosh, I've seen it do this like once before. I think there's some kind of queuing problem with the background threads still. I don't even know if I have proper UI for clearing this. And anyway, it's interesting running this in Ardor. It's a little bit easier to debug running the standalone version. Yeah, so it makes some interesting noises. Having the per grain stuff be really lightweight lets me use fairly high grain rates, so you can get grain synthesis up into the audio rates if you want, which doesn't usually sound great, but sometimes it's interesting for effects. Someone's asking if I looked into AI generated samples. That's kind of where this started. Like I've been using a bunch of samples from the TikTok text to speech, and they are indeed quite good for this purpose because they're so consistent. Maybe I'll grab the standalone version and we'll play with some more of the voices and then dive into the code. I feel like the main thing the code is missing right now, other than a lot of like fussing with the parameter values and ranges, is some UI for showing the current state of the synthesizer. So I've got that blank area where I really want to put a window diagram, since I think the window function is pretty much doing what I want, but it's really confusing unless you know exactly what's going on. And I want to show the current state of both the grains in the cache and also the individual waveforms in the voices. So I think just having a couple of simple real-time displays of that will make the whole thing much nicer and easier to use, and it'll also kind of look cool. Still running a debug build, but I don't think we need GDB. Also today I learned that Ardor has a just a like UI wide scale factor that also applies to the plugins, so that's why my plugin and all the other plugins were showing up as enormous, because I had set that in the Ardor preferences and then forgot about it. Okay, let's grab a couple of standalone audio things.
Bargaining, enraged, faithless, valued colonials, and pulchritudinous war, rapidly, unquestionably, dotage achieves shootings, bivalent, squidgy current, brick-eyed, concreting stupid, braces, moratorium, exactitude, nationists, inexorably economic, inching, falteringly, schemes, inquests, usher, develops, presumes thermally in the urbanism, non-resistance, night, unmounted cartridge, conceals half-roots, Aspired Fusey, Ebony Grip.
Captivities monist. Single digressive communal.
Versing CWT pusillanimous.
Spread could blowiest degenerate.
As coziest reabsorbing
How distrusting results more
hefting found demodulation punch tri-monthly
Excursion. Unsightly inoculations weighty non-curdling glacier blood-curdling glacier integral intrusions hitting sextons stylish valedictions voluble expectations teaked axon nagging knives terrifyingly staunch tensionally demented furious juggle negotiate sextons tensionally demented foots valedictions voluble intrusions hitting mesmerizing axon nagging serializable
Be finicky, it's 9 lives. New chicken and cheese dinner.
Oh boy, a new gone box. Pencils, everyone. Action. Can your TV pass?
Promise from San Francisco officials to beef up patrols and housing projects, trying to stem the violence.
Another couple of questions, or I guess just one. Somebody's wondering if audiobooks would be a good source to use. Yeah, a bunch of these are audiobooks, actually. There's a open audiobook or public domain audiobook project called LibriVox, and I've been trying those out. For most of these larger source audio files, like I've been getting stuck on. I mean, I haven't really been paying attention to this because I've been working on the plugin really, but I've been letting them run slowly because the software is currently really inefficient at dealing with long inputs. I wrote this assuming that we just had these little 30-second files, and so it's running them through some algorithms that are not great for long files, and it just results in a bunch of really giant temporary buffers in memory. So it's not great. I need to modify that before I can process things really efficiently, but actually I'm downloading those right now. That is still ongoing. There are terabytes and terabytes of audiobooks, and so I don't know how much of them I'm going to be able to use. I think the first step actually is I need to try to sort them by recording quality. So yeah, I have this background processing tool running on a couple of different things. I have 80s I guess 80s, 70s, and 90s TV commercials, and audiobooks, and all the TikTok voices, and Bob Ross episodes. So the tooling definitely needs work, but I've got some stuff already.
Told me something I never knew.
Oh, that's another neat question. It's a question about whether it would be possible to incorporate Tuco's vocalizations in this. That would be great. I would love to try feeding in the samples I've got of Tuco. I think I would need a lot of samples to make this particular approach work. I think like this starts getting really interesting when you have a large enough data set of audio that for any given like particular pitch that you want, you can find a large collection of samples that all have that pitch prominent in it. So I've thought about this before, like it would be nice for projects like this and maybe others to have a large database of Tuco's meows and purrs and other noises, but I haven't thought of a good way of collecting that, you know, like I'm not going to strap a microphone to him. I've thought about having microphones just like around the place where he might want to, you know, around like places where he hangs out and places where I hang out, but and maybe I should just do more of that like kind of wildlife camera style, like have some, you know, try not to just like be recording myself all the time, but there are definitely times when Tuco gets pretty vocal, and maybe I could just try to collect more of that and feed it into some software like this. It might be interesting.
What our moms used. Don't you cook with natural cheeses? Well, what do you think goes into Velveeta?
Cancer. It's a frightening word, especially when it's cancer in kids. Cancer. It's a frightening word.
On TV. On TV. Mason.
For the office. For the office. For the office.
Kiss me out. Kiss me out. Kiss me out. Kiss me out.
Cable TV. On cable TV. But gasoline rationing may soon be the least of cable TV.
Let your imagination continue what you need to do. This food shows turn months plain shows trees food imagination. And I want a very plain long music. I want a very thin coat of all our Russian blue, all our Russian blue, our Russian blue, our Russian blue, our Russian blue, all our Russian blue, our Russian blue. Each paint, where we worry about, could use a that's man. Maybe painting, you could use a one. That's we'll be able to.
And that'll
painting, worry about. Could use a one. Give you maybe you could use a one. Where we that's painting, each paint, painting. At least that's what color you want. Down, go right in. Very dark. Doing that. I know there's. Then you pull. That's color you want. Down, go right in. Color you. I know there's. Doing that. Right in. Pull through the same color. And yet you use rings and say tree here. Make some little pull through. I can hear.
And that'll do some little drizzles.
Good dry 2-inch brush. Or you could use a one. Be able to at least a little touch of cad yellow.
Let a little bit of water go in there, and that'll do some little drizzles.
Rain. That And merged with weapons, given a one spring things and
one in general. Furthermore,
Tomato on the final own hand.
Numerous
Rose design.
Orleans car meaningful plans for the third
wins a great
creations, Louisianians, and more.
the name
Done by back toll rates, killer towers, man.
the major meaning.
The newspaper
Meaning
translate line
intervened to
by twists.
Any okay whom has
Lay company.
one
In this arena,
On the valley. To a town. For the sake of
politics,
illegal.
days and cat.
Mobile onto outer verge. Oh, there is N. Wording is in the land of the
in the where beware were needed
experience by
remote. Dad,
my wonder or that king with me to me here below on them.
those groups
comes so meager the ancient roving round tomorrow
live
to the
like
one
Funds did not means many. Hope.
so lamented.
To move it. Fiery spirit.
Beyond
moved
in
moon them now behind
in unison.
Alright, maybe this is a good time to go back to the coding. I don't know if anybody else is enjoying playing with this, but I think it's interesting. I guess there's one easy thing I wanted to do, which was to just put like a piano keyboard on the UI so that it was easy to visualize the MIDI data that's going in. I mean, most environments have some other way to do that, but it seemed like it was handy and pretty easy to do. Keyboard component. Oh, this also listens to keyboard input. Oh, that's convenient. I vaguely remember this from one of the juice tutorials. I'm actually kind of curious how this is implemented. I'm guessing it's like a vector of atomic ints or something. Yeah. What is this? What is this critical section for? Oh, is that lock mostly for the queue of events that we're merging in? Why does this take the lock there? It seems like this lock acquisition could move down to after processing the buffer, right? Hmm. It's funny, they're updating all these atomic ints while they also have the mutex held. Okay, whatever. It's good enough. Just use this. Oh, do I want to put that here? I think I want to put that in my synthesizer subclass. Actually, I guess it does probably belong in the audio processor and not the synthesizer. The synthesizer doesn't really care about this, it keeps track of state on its own. Audio processor is like Juice's thing that is, it maps pretty much one-to-one to an audio plugin, although it doesn't necessarily have to be a plugin. It's a thing that's kind of plugin shaped, but you could use it internally in your application also. Do go. I guess the keyboard could be just between audio processor and audio processor editor. The other components don't need to know about it. Just annoyed by the formatting of that for no reason.
Misfortunes, humor, adoring eyes.
Non-controversial. 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 Dissolved freighter frats.
Oh. I was trying to figure out what that click was from. I have window A set really short though. I think that's a one sample window which is causing the click.
Winter swagger Archangel's edgily. Flow livability. Grandstands compelling. Frig shadow alpaca nice. Wobble diggest wine glasses. Tincture most. Mantra slew irresponsibility. Summons as if
We continue now. We continue now.
Told me something I never knew.
Your friends.
To get the job done right, count on the right man.
Hot baked potatoes.
Just don't wear me that seven. We just blew on this. Just sort of think like a cloud.
I'm into you, 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 I'm into you. I'm starting way out.
I don't know how much I want to overthink the concurrency design for this right now. So there's a synthesizer with a bunch of voices, and each voice has a cue. All of that is mostly just accessed on the real-time audio thread. It will occasionally grab a not very highly contested mutex, I hope, to get data from the shared waveform cache. I guess the first fork in the road that I'm noticing is, do I have the UI access the data the synthesizer is already using, or do I have the synthesizer write its state into some format that the UI can pick it up in efficiently? Like, one thing that comes to mind is to have effectively like a per frame state accumulator that's maybe like a well, now I have to think about the representation. I was going to say it could just be like a buffer of like state flags for each grain indicating which ones I'm using and which ones are loading, which ones, you know, like the playback position within all the buffers. I guess it's worth thinking about the level of granularity I want to see in the UI. I'd like to see the current status of every grain. So I'd like to see maybe like a rectangle drawn on top of that map indicating like which grains are still waiting to load from disk. Maybe highlight those in red or something so you can see where it's lagging, and then indicate which grains are actually currently playing, and maybe which grains are in the cache and RAM. Although that's less important. I'm more interested in which ones are currently playing and which ones are loading. And then the window graph, I mean, I want to show the window function itself, but that seems like the easy part. I think the more complicated part is that I'd like to show the playback positions of all the voices. And I was thinking maybe like a vertical line per voice or something, but now I'm thinking like, how do I even want to represent grain repeats? I can imagine a, I don't know, like a ladder, like a sequence of vertical lines that are all moving down the waveform, indicating where all the repeats are as they cross the window. And I could even show the waveforms themselves, if that's practical. I could have the UI actually like overlap all the waveforms that are currently being rendered in that window view, like within the window. So if I was going to actually draw the waveforms, I mean, I don't think there's any substitute to having, there's no reason not to share the waveform data. The waveform data is all immutable, so if we have just a reference count, or a reference to the waveforms that we're currently mixing, that's all the UI could possibly want there. I think the part that's more sensitive in the design is like, how do I pass on that list of current waveforms between threads? Right, like it really is tempting just to have access to read from this queue. So maybe each voice has something I can call into that will internally take some lock maybe, and then actually I need to double check like where I'm at with like what locking is actually my responsibility and what's done by the juice synthesizer base class. Currently, as this thing stands, it's just reading from the so the only data that's getting modified from the real-time thread right now is that I'm loading things from the cache, and I've got my own mutexes protecting that cache. But all the other modifiable data that my audio thread is accessing is only used by the audio thread. Well, maybe we should try some Tuco meows if I have any handy. I just don't think I have I don't think I have enough right now for the database to be super interesting. I don't Let's see what I have like really handy, because I know I have some that are actually pretty easy to get to. I don't know if I have them somewhere I can get to them on this computer. Very little of this has any audio. This is mostly just video of him sleeping. Or just like video of stuff where I was streaming and he happened to be like nearby. Yeah, I don't know where they are right off the top of my head. I mean, I think they're in a different disk that I can't get to from here. But it's also not very much. Like, it's just maybe a minute or so total. And for this process to be interesting, like, it needs like tens of hours of audio probably. Oh, where do we maintain the association between the index? I was thinking if, you know, if we're dipping in here and reading from this queue to update the UI, this is mostly what I need. But do we actually need to know what index goes with this? I think we do. You might have noticed this while I was playing with it earlier, but it can actually, like if I'm playing grains from one file and I switch files, there can still be grains from the old file playing. It doesn't force everything to stop. You know, it could be pretty neat to actually be able to switch inputs really quickly and still have things in a cache somewhere. Currently, you know, it doesn't try to keep stuff from previous inputs. It'll eventually free that cache when no one else is referring to it. Anyway, I did notice a bug earlier where it seemed like somebody was using the old index, and now I'm wondering if yeah, if somebody here is actually not capable of referring to the correct index. So yeah, we have an index pointer in the sound, and okay, yeah, and the voice has a current sound, so we should be able to keep track of that. Yeah, I feel like this module just needs another public data structure that's like a synthesizer state visualization or something. And then the voice knows how to fill those out, and then the synthesizer can fill it out on all the voices. And I guess it's just an array of all the grains were playing, is that right? So there's going to be a bunch of grains that are either just not loaded at all, or they're loaded but they're not actually playing yet. I do want to represent those just as like a little dot on the graph, but you know, I don't really need to worry about any further information there. I guess this is one of those issues where the problem feels kind of under constrained. It's like, well, I could do anything, and then, you know, inevitably the thing that I pick will turn out to be terrible. So I want to look at what other constraints I have and try to work backwards from those. And so on the other end of the system is a UI that I want to be rendering reasonably rapidly. So how am I actually doing that? It seems like the first decision to make there is, am I doing it using Juice's 2D subsystem, or do I use OpenGL? I think the path of least resistance right now is to use Juice's 2D subsystem. It doesn't seem like I'm doing anything where shaders are going to be like a huge benefit. I could do some bling with them, but I don't know that I actually need 3D graphics or heavily accelerated 2D for anything at the moment. So it's tempting to say we stick with Juice's rendering framework unless something is terrible there. So then if we're asking Juice to render this, I want a bunch of small anti-aliased rectangles. So what data structure would it want that to appear in? It's probably something where I can just I think Juice's renderer is all immediate mode. Like, I don't know. I haven't looked at how they interact with 2D acceleration engines, but I think for the most part, they're just doing 2D graphics operations like filling paths and drawing rectangles and stuff, and expecting either that they happen immediately or that if there's some kind of command batching happening, that they're not responsible for it. This also might be something I'm doing with multiple UI widgets, because the map and the window thing that I've got they're trying to be separate components. I mean, it would be nice if both of these components could just subscribe to a listener that gets access to something on some thread at some time. That's when it starts to break down. Because like it's a very UI kind of deal to try to figure out when things get drawn. But this data is coming in from a component that doesn't really have any sense of UI stuff. It's all just the audio processing backend. When I'm actively rendering, it makes sense just to set a timer and try to keep up with some frame rate. It also seems maybe worth having a mode where I'm not just like updating the UI continuously when nothing's happening. So this might be a state where I want some layer here that's starting a timer when we get a MIDI event, and then stopping the timer if the synth has been idle. Something like that. I could fuss with inconsequential parts of the UI while I'm thinking about the bigger problems. I'm probably going to want to move that keyboard again. I don't know, I'm still unsure what I want the UI to look like, and it might be different once I have the waveform graph in here. I also might want the waveform graph to be taller than the keyboard. I feel like maybe that's the thing to actually do, is to start trying to code the waveform graph, but I want to have some sense of what the inputs to that look like. It seems like broadly there's going to be a window function that I want to draw as an outline, a bunch of waveforms that I want to draw for the active grains, maybe like a subset of those depending on how many there are. And then some vertical lines that show the current playback positions everywhere that we're playing back, which could be a bunch of places. I don't want to ever have like multiple components trying to keep a frame rate timer for this. It does seem like I should have like I'm thinking about the interface between this window part and the map part that are both going to be trying to display real-time data. How does this keyboard thing handle callbacks from the audio thread to the UI? this always run its timer? I guess so. Fine, maybe Juice is not worried about having a bunch of desynchronized UI callbacks that are all trying to draw frames at different times. That bothers me a little bit, like so many things in this framework, but not enough to actually try to work around it. Okay, they just have a whole bunch of different parts of their UI all have local timers. That's great. Guess we'll just follow this pattern. And it is just always running, but they do use a single atomic value to just exit early if there haven't been any changes. It's tempting to think about this conceptually as being a snapshot of the rendering state that gets taken when render next block is called. But I think in practice, I'm not actually generating any state that's not already represented in the queue. So if I'm fine with just having the UI pull this queue every so often. So if we are polling, is there an early out that I can give it? Not much is going on. Yeah, I don't know. It's probably fine to just loop over all the voices at every UI poll and then see what's going on. So if we're doing that, it's a timer that the component owns on a thread with the main UI lock. That thread can take some time to actually draw the UI, but it should be very quick about anything that might contend with locks on the rendering thread. So I guess the kernel of this is that somebody's got to briefly, with the Q log held. So somebody's got to, with the Q log held, either whether it's during render next block or on the UI thread elsewhere, somebody's got to take the time to examine the queue and generate a data structure that the UI can use for its rendering, which might take a longer amount of time and shouldn't need to access the queue. So one way that could happen is, if we weren't having any boundaries between these objects, the UI could just lock the queue, create that array of rectangles when it reads the queue, and then unlock the queue. But I need to figure out where the boundary is between components, because that's like two private interfaces. But it helps to think about the control flow, because the UI with its timer is going to be the one actually invoking this code, even though, it depends on a resource that could affect the audio thread. Okay, one way to do this without having to create some temporary data structure would be to have, to have something that takes a callback, and we give it one record at a time. And then that record might turn into something that we end up drawing later. I really don't think it's bad to just have a separate data structure that indicates the state of the synthesizer, though. It does seem like that's going to have to exist at some point, even if it's just temporary. And if we are building it, we might as well put it somewhere that it can be shared by all the UI components. So maybe it both conceptually and physically is a thing that we build during rendering and then swap in to a public place. So what would that look like? That could be another reference counted object, like a state snapshot or a scoreboard or a overview. Right, and if we just wrap up everything into this one object, we can create it whenever it's convenient, and then treat it as immutable after that, and then anyone who wants it can just keep a reference. Hmm. I guess I'm using juice as reference counted objects for this part. Some interesting subtleties in the design that come up even thinking about some simple things, like how do I want to get the current window? What does that actually mean? The UI changes the window parameters, and then when you start a note, that note retains whatever those parameters are. And actually, it would be nice to visualize the windows of all the ongoing notes. From inside the synthesizer, what that looks like is each voice has a single sound that's active at once, and that sound has some parameters, including the window parameters. Right, there's no getter for the window right now, because currently no one outside here actually needs to know that. I'm gonna use standard vector here. I guess I'm already using standard vector. It's funny because most of Juice uses their own containers, but standard vector is actually pretty good. It's like tempting to try to include more information than this, but I'm thinking about what I might actually represent on the graph. There isn't much space there. I guess the other thing that's bothering me about this is I don't know to what extent I want to be thinking of lists of grains as these things that are fairly short from frame to frame versus having events that maybe modify a list of grains that exists longer term. And that starts to matter if I want to graph what's in the cache, because that could end up being a fairly large number of grains. I don't want to have, I don't want like each frame of the UI to end up dealing with a separate, separate instance of iterating over all the grains in the cache, right? If we're dealing with that, then I want to be able to like render an overlay image that I add and subtract parts of. So I could think of something that's more like a listener that has callbacks for, this grain entered this state, and then my UI widget can subscribe to those callbacks and actually paint those updates onto a little image. And then use that as one of the layers in its actual redraws. That still requires like some kind of handoff between the stuff that's happening on the rendering thread and the UI. I also might just assume I don't display the cache status, or if I do, I have a separate way to render that. Yeah, I guess that's kind of what this hinges on, like this part of the design. Either I choose to represent these in some way that handles showing all the cached grains also. That could be very large, and all of those don't have any waveform data. Or if I actually only do care about grains that are currently playing or about to play. Those are all, so queued grains have waveform data, but I'm not playing them yet. playing grains or playing loading grains don't have a waveform, but I know the window parameters. It does just seem like this should be just like one big flat array that the UI can deal with. Hmm. I could try to do something that doesn't involve duplicating the window parameters in this array for every grain, but I think it's significantly simpler to just store the grain waveform key, which has the window and the grain number and the speed ratio. It's like all the parameters we need to look up the grain. So I think just that and the actual loaded waveform go in the list. Okay, I should have basically the same named function on voice and on synthesizer, and then synth will collect them from the voice. Oh, actually, I don't really want to expose incomplete lists outside this object. Hmm. I guess it does make sense for this object to be a bit more full-featured and for it to be more like you know, like a central repository of state that the UI and this stuff can all attach to. Alright, synthesizer gives me access to its lock. The lock is protected, so as a subclass I can use its lock. I think that's what I want. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no reason for me to share that lock. The hang up I'm hitting right now is that I think the object I want to expose is actually like one level of encapsulation above this. The actual reference counted list, I think, should be something that this object maintains and can return. I think I need something else around that to, excuse me, maybe do other things, but at the very minimum, it's probably the one responsible for the locking. Oh, no, what do I even call that? Maybe I should just have the UI worry about storing its own data and provide a way to do callbacks on like callbacks to get grain state information on the rendering thread. Is that really what I want to do though? Oh.
Still a little bit heavy where they look like they're maybe
See,
a bit heavy where they look like maybe.
And over in here, you can see where I've done some.
Come into
see where I've done some. Come into you can see where I've done some. Go here and over into here. You can see where I've done some.
Over the top of. Now we're going to repeat this stroke. Remember?
Areas in there still a little bit
lighter green that we mixed up.
Areas in there still a little bit heavy where they look like that maybe.
Just using the listener pattern is kind of growing on me. I think the idea of using a listener pattern for this is growing on me. Just have like a grain voice listener, and it would have methods called on probably just something arbitrary called once per grain during rendering. And it would just get like just a little struct that has a status information. And that seems pretty straightforward. The UI could just do what it wants with that. Did it go? Like for the waveform display, I think it would probably, oh Tuco, you're so sweet. It'd probably have like a bunch of slots for waves that it could display, and it would update one of those slots with a new reference count or a new pointer. What else? And the map thing could even like update an array. So I guess the way this works is that each voice has an array of listeners. It's just a little superfluous because those are all going to be the same, but a lot of this stuff doesn't make a lot of sense to do for the entire synthesizer, just the way the classes are structured. Well, maybe it's time to have a little bit of cat hangout, and then I can wrap up the stream. It feels like it's dragging a little bit. I don't want this to be boring slog through software, but thanks for coming with me on the journey. Oh, honey. Like, if I did want to keep track of all the grains in the cache, either at some point, you know, on some interval, oh, Tuco, what are you doing? Are you trying to join the chat? Don't be chewing wires, honey. Oh, baby. Oh, Tuco, how did you do that? All this fur. Tuco, there's fur everywhere. Don't. appreciate a good cat toy, but those are not good for your teeth, honey. What few teeth you have left. What a kitty. He's just melting in my hand sometimes. Well, that's it for today's stream. I will see you in a couple days. We'll continue on this or maybe something else. Let me know what you're interested in, but I'll bring you some kind of project content whenever I can. Have a good day, everyone.